I would be careful with that one because which Bible do we go for? Because
Can I address that point because you made it twice now?
Yes.
So, which Bible do you go for? Here's my challenge. Find me a Bible that doesn't teach that Jesus is sinless and perfect. Because the reality is, until you can produce a Bible that teaches a different gospel than the one that I teach, then I don't have an argument. Because the reality is, Christianity is not like Islam. I'm inviting you to a better religion than Islam. Islam is a religion of the book. Islam is a religion of the book. Christianity, are you listening?
I'm listening.
Christianity is a religion about following Jesus as his disciple. It's about the message. And the message of every single Bible, and I challenge you, the message of every single Bible is consistent. Christ, who was sinless, died on a cross, rose on the third day, which confirmed his claims to be the Messiah. The Messiah is a divine figure. He is God and worthy of your worship. So bow down and worship him and become his disciple. And every single Bible that you pick up, every single one that is a Bible accepted by the church, will teach that message. So anyone you want.
My concern with the Bible is, what is the words of Jesus from? Like, if we go back to the Qur'an, even if you want to argue the Qur'an and say there was convenient verses or these fear and all the rest of it, all Qur'ans are going to date back to, whether you believe it or not, round about the peninsula of the life of the Prophet. Right? For argument's sake, within the peninsula of the life
Go
of
on,
the
go on.
Prophet, right?
Yep.
Whereas every Bible we've got, is there one today that has actually been created or presented at the time of Jesus?
Right.
I can't seem to see anything from his time.
Right, so let's address that point, because the point is based on a misunderstanding. The reality is, when Jesus was there 2,000 years ago, he didn't bring a book and he didn't give a book. He was the message. That's what it says in Hebrews chapter 1, that God has spoken to our people long ago in former times by the words of the prophets, but in this time has spoken to us in the person of his Son, the Word. That's what it says in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 to 4.
From the very beginning of Scripture, the gospel was never merely a book, but the good news rooted in the promise of God himself. The word gospel comes from the Greek euangelion, a combination of EU meaning good and angelion meaning message or news. Thus, the gospel is the good news, a proclamation of victory not defined primarily by ink on parchment, but by the saving work of God on behalf of humanity. This promise first appears in Genesis 3:15, often called the Proto-Evangelium, the first gospel. There God declares that the seed of the woman will crush the serpent's head. In Hebrew, the word zara refers to offspring or seed. Strikingly, in this case, it is not the seed of a man, but of a woman, a prophecy pointing to a miraculous birth. The victory promised here would not come through weapons or earthly kingdoms, but through a person born of a woman who would destroy the power of sin and the devil. This is the heart of the good news from the very beginning. As the story unfolds, the prophets expand and reinforce this promise. Isaiah foretells that a virgin will bear a child called Emmanuel. Micah prophesies the birth of the Messiah in Bethlehem, a small town whose origins stretch from ancient times. Isaiah 53 paints the picture of the suffering servant who would bear the sins of many. Together, these prophecies form a mosaic of good news, all pointing more clearly toward one person, Jesus Christ. When the New Testament opens, Mark declares, "The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." Here, the gospel is not introduced as a new document, but as a reality embodied in the person of Jesus himself. He is the good news, not merely the messenger of it. John adds even more forcefully, "The Word became flesh." In other words, the gospel that once appeared as promises and prophecies has now taken on flesh and blood, walking among humanity. Paul describes this moment in Galatians 4:4 as the time when the fullness of time had come. From the dawn of history to the final words of the prophets, everything pointed to this moment, God sending his Son, born of a woman. This was the direct fulfillment of the promise in Genesis 3:15. What was once hidden in promise is now revealed in history. The book of Hebrews confirms this shift. God once spoke through the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken through his Son. The difference is crucial. Before, the word came through messages, visions, and writings. Now, the word has come in the form of a person. Therefore, Jesus is not merely the bearer of the gospel, he is the gospel. He is the good news promised from the beginning, revealed throughout the history of Israel, and fulfilled when the appointed time had come.
Of his Son, the Word. That's what it says in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. Slight paraphrase on my part, not an exact quotation. Now, let me finish. But when Jesus was arrived, the Old Testament was the Bible. And actually, we do have a copy of the Bible from the 1st century. They're called the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were preserved by the Essene community in the valleys of Qumran, in caves, and we found them in the 20th century. So yes, to answer your question, the Bible that Jesus read, the Bible that Jesus believed in, we have a copy of it from the time of Jesus. Furthermore, no scholar on earth, no scholar at all, not N.T. Wright, not Dr. Bart Ehrman, not Dr. Bruce Baxter, not Dr. James White, not Dr. Dan Wallace, all of them agree that all 27 books of the New Testament, all of them were written in the 1st century. There is no dispute on this question. So the reality is, no scholar is arguing that the New Testament was written outside of the time of Jesus.
My concern is that none of this is actually, like, if you go back to, like, for example, you says to me that the prophet has feared the people. This is convenient verses. He's telling his people. So everything we're talking about the Quran, whether it's negative or positive, regardless of which side it is, we can turn around and say the prophet says this, the Sahaba said this, the prophet said this. It's a ping pong effect, right? Tabari and all these tafsir are after. But where is that ping-pong effect with the Bible? Okay, you're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is pre-Jesus. Where have we got these books of the verbal communications of Jesus? Not his disciples, but him himself talking to his people saying, I am this and I am that. Not his disciples writing it, but these verbal narrations from Jesus himself. Where are these?
Okay, so let me reply to that. So firstly, I do need to correct you. The Dead Sea Scrolls are contemporaneous to Jesus Christ.
That's a lie.
The Essene community was contemporaneous to Jesus Christ. They were there at the same time that Jesus was there. Thank you very much, sister. God bless you.
You're a liar.
Okay, we'll talk later. Right, so bless her heart. That's sweet. So are you listening, bro?
Yeah, I'm listening.
If you want, we swap, so he's not shouting in your ear. So my first point is that the Bible used by Jesus, we have a copy of it from the 1st century. Called the Dead Sea Scrolls. Secondly, you're working to both a double standard and a false paradigm. The double standard is that as a Muslim, you're committed to the belief that Jesus gave an Injil. Well, let me flip the question on you. Where's that Injil? Because if you're going to say that my Bible is a distortion of your Injil, you've got to actually produce the Injil to prove that point. And you have no evidence at all of the Injil. But here's what I have. I have the quotations of church fathers like Clement of Rome, who quotes and references the gospel stories, showing that the gospel stories are first set earlier than him in 90 AD. I have the references of the Didache, which reference the traditions of Jesus before the 1st century. I have writings of the church fathers that quote the Gospels as early as 120 AD. And for them to quote the Gospels outside of Israel by 120 AD means that the Gospels must have been written early so that copies could be produced to arrive there. So the historical evidence demonstrates that those Gospels are early. They were made by the church, and the church was founded by Jesus Christ and the inheritor of his story.
Muslims approach this question from a Qur'anic framework that assumes the existence of a book called the Injil of Isa, supposedly given directly to Jesus. On that basis, they demand evidence of an original Injil and accuse the Christian Bible of being a distortion. Yet from a historical perspective, the category of a separate book of the Injil simply never existed. Jesus never wrote a book, nor did he bring down a text from heaven. He himself was the Injil, the living good news, the Word made flesh. What was later written by the apostles and eyewitnesses was their testimony about him, and these are what we know today as the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Historical evidence shows that these gospel writings emerged very close to the events of Jesus' life. Scholars place their composition between AD 65 and 95, only a few decades after the crucifixion. This evidence is strengthened further by the witness of the early church fathers. Clement of Rome, writing around AD 95, already quotes gospel traditions and the letters of Paul. Ignatius of Antioch, writing in the early 2nd century, clearly knew and used the words of Jesus as preserved in the Gospels. Polycarp echoed the very same sayings. Such quotations would only have been possible if the Gospels had already been in circulation, allowing them to be read and used as references by churches beyond Judea. Even more, Papias, writing around AD 120, directly names the Gospels of Mark and Matthew. The fact that these writings had reached communities outside Israel by the early 2nd century proves that the Gospels must have been composed earlier, copied, and widely distributed. The claim that the Gospels are merely late inventions collapses in light of such textual and historical evidence. When the Qur'an speaks of the Injil as God's revelation to Isa, from the Christian perspective, this is fulfilled not in a separate book, but in the person of Jesus himself. As the book of Hebrews affirms, God once spoke through the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us through his Son. The true Injil, then, is not a lost book, but the living person of Jesus Christ, faithfully witnessed in writing by his apostles. The historical reliability of the New Testament Gospels, the citations of the Church Fathers, and the rapid spread of these texts in the 1st century all testify to the same reality. The good news is authentic. It comes from eyewitnesses, and it flows from the one who was, from the beginning, the Gospel himself.